The sea that night looked like an endless sheet of black metal. No moon, no stars, just the quiet hum of engines and the low, steady vibration running through the steel bones of USS Washington, a giant gliding invisibly across the Pacific. The crew had gotten used to the darkness by now, but even seasoned sailors felt something different in the air. A kind of stillness. A kind of promise. It was late 1942, in the middle of the brutal Guadalcanal campaign, where every night felt like rolling dice with the devil. The Japanese dominated after sunset. Their night optics, their training, their deadly Type 93 torpedoes, everything favored them. The Americans knew this. They had the scars to prove it. But tonight something new was riding aboard Washington. A secret weapon. A shift in the balance. Radar. Not the old, clunky sets from years past. This was SG search radar and the Mark 8 fire control radar, the most advanced technology to ever sit inside the steel walls of a battleship. Screens glowing like small blue suns, operators hunched over the scopes, hands steady, breaths controlled. This was the night the Americans intended to rewrite the story. Just after midnight, as the task force made its silent patrol, faint blips appeared on the SG radar. Small at first. Then sharper. Clearer. Moving. Contact bearing 260, long range, the radar operator announced, voice tight but steady. On the bridge, Admiral Willis leaned in, eyes narrowing. That'll be them. The Japanese squadron was confident, almost arrogant, when it came to nighttime action. They believed the dark ocean was theirs. They believed American ships were blind. But Washington saw everything. With remarkable precision, the radar plotted the course, speed, and exact heading of a Japanese battleship approaching. The Americans didn't need spotlights or flares. They didn't even need eyes. They had numbers. They had angles. They had the truth glowing silently on their radars. Captain Gatch gave the order, prepare main battery. Down in the plotting room, the fire control team entered data into the Mark 8 system. Elevation, bearing, wind, drift, everything was calculated electronically. Turrets began to move, turning with heavy yet smooth grace toward the invisible enemy. Still, no one topside could see a thing. The ocean was pure black. And yet Washington was aiming directly at a ship more than 10 miles away. In the Japanese formation, the battleship steamed forward confidently, unaware that a 35,000-ton American Titan had already locked on. To them, it was just another night run, another opportunity to unleash their superior torpedoes. The American ships? Probably as blind as ever. That belief lasted right up until the sky flashed white. Washington's first salvo erupted like a thunder god waking from sleep. A massive blast of flame poured from the 16-inch guns, lighting up the night for miles. The shockwave rippled across the deck, even hardened sailors felt it in their ribs. A moment later, across the ocean, fire blossomed on the Japanese battleship. The first hit landed. Not by luck. Not by chance. But by cold, perfect radar calculation. The Japanese crew staggered. Men who had trained years for night combat suddenly found themselves hit by a ship they couldn't even see. Panic spread across their decks as officers shouted, trying to figure out where the barrage came from. But by the time the panic had a name, the second salvo arrived. Then the third. For the next 7 minutes, Washington became a machine. A cold, relentless executioner firing with mechanical precision. Radar corrected every shot. Computers adjusted every angle. Fire control teams called ranges with pinpoint accuracy. 9 gigantic 16-inch shells slammed into the Japanese battleship in rapid succession. Each shell weighed as much as a small car. Each explosion ripped steel open like paper. Each hit threw fire high into the sky, turning the sea into a flickering hellscape. One shell smashed through a main turret, sending debris flying. Another tore deep into engineering spaces, flooding compartments instantly. Fires burst across the decks, feeding on oil and ammunition. The battleship began to list. Her engines sputtered. Her radios went silent. Her lights flickered out. Her proud silhouette became a burning skeleton against the darkness. Damage control teams raced through smoke-filled corridors, hoses in hand, but the flames were too strong. Bulkheads were collapsing. Water poured in through jagged holes beneath the waterline. The ship was dying, and everyone aboard could feel it. The Japanese had dominated night combat for years. But tonight, they were fighting an enemy who could see through darkness. Meanwhile, USS Washington maneuvered with precision. Radar not only guided her guns, it guided her path. Operators tracked possible torpedo launches, and Washington adjusted her course before the Japanese even fired. She stayed at perfect distance, always one move ahead. Admiral Lee, calm as stone, oversaw the orchestration. Keep it steady. Maintain range. Let radar do its work. Washington didn't take a single hit that night. And yet she delivered the kind of destruction battleships were designed for but rarely achieved. As the last volleys faded and the Japanese battleship burned in the dark, the explosions grew weaker. Then slower. Then silent. The once mighty ship began to sink stern first, swallowed by the same black water she once commanded. Fire hissed as it touched the waves. Gradually, the bow lifted toward the sky, just for a moment, before sliding beneath the surface with a long, low groan. Darkness returned. Silence returned. Only the faint smell of smoke drifted across the wind. Aboard Washington, the crew stared into the void. They had fought for 7 minutes. 7 minutes that had flipped the script of naval warfare. They didn't cheer. They didn't celebrate. They just breathed, knowing they had just witnessed history. Radar had proven its power. Night belonged to whoever could see first. And after this night, the American Navy would never again fear the dark. The silence that followed the sinking of the Japanese battleship felt almost unnatural, as if the ocean itself was trying to recover from the violence that had torn through it moments before. On the bridge of USS Washington, the dim red lights glowed faintly across the faces of exhausted sailors, their expressions a mix of adrenaline, disbelief, and a quiet, heavy awe. They knew they had trained for this, drilled for this, but no one truly expected radar to perform with such flawless, almost eerie precision. This wasn't just a battle won, it was a message sent across the Pacific, loud and unmistakable. Washington's gunners stood inside their turrets catching their breath, feeling the ringing in their ears slowly fade. Some leaned against the steel walls, still shaken by the concussions of their own guns. Others stared outward through slits or hatches, trying to see through the darkness that had swallowed everything again. After the blinding flashes of their 16-inch guns, the night felt even blacker than before. Deep below deck, engineers checked the status of Washington's machinery, relieved to find every engine, every pump, every generator still functioning smoothly. The Japanese hadn't even come close to landing a hit, and that fact alone was staggering. For months, American ships had taken brutal beatings in nighttime engagements, often blindsided by Japanese destroyers and their deadly long lance torpedoes. But tonight, the hunter had become the hunted, and the hunted had gone down in flames. Admiral Willis Lee allowed himself a slow exhale as he studied the radar screens one more time. No new threats. No returning vessels. No shadows creeping along the edges. Just the quiet hum of electronics and the faint trace of distant waves. He wasn't a man who celebrated easily, but he knew this moment would be remembered. He also knew that the Japanese hadn't expected anything like this. For years they believed their night advantage was unbreakable. But technology had cracked it wide open. On the Japanese side of the ocean, the news would be slow to arrive. Survivors from the sunken ship, few in number, would eventually describe the horror, shells slamming in without warning, the ship erupting from within, flames roaring through broken compartments. They had no idea America had mastered a new form of night fighting. They only knew that death had come from the dark, precise and merciless. Washington's crew, meanwhile, began preparing for the next move. Orders moved through the decks: stand by for potential counterattacks, maintain radar sweeps, continue monitoring for Japanese torpedo wakes. Even in victory, the Pacific demanded caution. The Japanese Navy was wounded, not defeated. Stoic officers passed by sailors still shaken from the intensity of the battle. A few offered nods of approval or brief murmured praise, but mostly they maintained the ship's disciplined calm. Celebration could wait. The war wasn't done with them, not even close. Still, moments of quiet reflection washed over the ship. A boatswain's mate leaned on the rail, staring into the black water, trying to comprehend how quickly it all happened. 7 minutes. That's all it took for a battleship, miles away, invisible to the naked eye, to tear apart another capital ship that had once symbolized Japanese naval pride. He wondered what the enemy must have felt in their final moments. Shock. Fear. Confusion. Or simply disbelief that the Americans could see them in complete darkness. A gunnery officer replayed the engagement in his mind, remembering the glow of the range indicators, the steady updates from radar, the unwavering calm in the fire control room. It all worked, every system, every calculation, every adjustment. It felt less like a battle and more like a demonstration. The kind of moment that would be studied for generations. Elsewhere, Washington's captain, Glenn B. Gatch, met briefly with Admiral Lee. They spoke quietly, reviewing what had happened and what it meant for the campaign ahead. Radar had proven its worth beyond any doubt. And that meant new tactics, new confidence, and new possibilities for the entire U.S. Navy. "This changes everything," Gatch said softly. Lee nodded, though part of him had known this from the moment the first salvo hit home. Radar wasn't just a tool, it was the future, and tonight the future had arrived with thunderous force. Out on the open deck, a few sailors sat together beside a 20mm gun mount. None of them talked much. The adrenaline had drained from their bodies, leaving a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion. One of them finally broke the silence: "We did something tonight, something big." Another nodded slowly, eyes still fixed on the black waves. "Yeah. They'll be talking about this long after we're gone." The ship pressed onward, engines beating a slow, steady rhythm beneath the steel. Radar operators continued sweeping the area, but the seas remained clear. The enemy destroyers that had accompanied the Japanese battleship fled into the darkness, unwilling to face a ship that could strike with godlike vision in the night. For Washington, the path forward was simple: regroup with friendly forces and prepare for whatever the campaign demanded next. But for history, the path forward had changed forever. Gone were the days when night belonged to the Japanese Navy. Gone were the moments when American ships sailed blind, hoping luck favored them. Radar had stolen the night from the empire that once ruled it. As dawn crept slowly over the horizon, the first faint light spread across Washington's decks, revealing a ship still covered in soot and smoke residue from her own guns. The wind carried the faint smell of burnt powder, lingering like a memory. Sailors stepped into the pale morning light, their bodies tired, their faces marked with the signs of a long and volatile night. Yet the sunrise felt different, warmer somehow, more hopeful. Like proof that the night had been conquered. From the bridge, the sea looked peaceful again, gentle waves rolling under a sky that had forgotten the violence of hours before. But for USS Washington and her crew, this wasn't just another night survived. It was the turning of a tide. A demonstration that technology, precision, and discipline could rewrite everything the enemy believed. The crew didn't know it yet, but historians one day would mark this night as one of the most important in naval warfare. A moment when a single battleship, guided not by eyesight but by invisible waves on a screen, changed the nature of combat forever. And as Washington continued her journey across the Pacific, there was one truth every sailor carried quietly in his heart: they had proven that even in the darkest night, victory belonged to those who could see. In the days that followed the engagement, USS Washington's victory became the quiet heartbeat of every conversation aboard the fleet. Not officially, orders were strict about operational silence: but sailors whispered about it in the mess, engineers murmured about it over machinery noise, and officers discussed it behind closed doors. It wasn't bragging. It was awe. They had witnessed a new kind of warfare unfold right beneath their feet, powered by screens, computations, and invisible pulses of radio energy. For the first time, American sailors didn't fear the creeping shadows of night. They respected it, yes, but they no longer felt blind. Washington continued her patrols, but every movement felt different now. The crew carried themselves with a confidence shaped not by pride, but by understanding. They had seen radar used at its full potential, and they knew that, if applied across the fleet, it would transform the way America fought. It was as if they'd been handed a lantern in a cave where everyone else still stumbled in darkness. The officers knew that the Japanese would adapt eventually, but for now, the advantage was theirs, and they intended to use it. The battle's aftermath stretched far beyond Washington's decks. Word reached headquarters, then commanders, then strategists. Reports circulated with precision, range data, firing solutions, radar performance, salvo timelines. Analysts reading the logs felt a chill. It wasn't just the efficiency that struck them, but the cold mathematics of it. 9 hits in 7 minutes. At night. At long range. A result that even bright daylight and full visibility rarely delivered. Senior officers quietly shifted their thinking. The days of relying solely on optical rangefinders and star shells were ending. Radar wasn't just an aid, it was the new backbone of naval warfare. Meanwhile, far across the ocean, the Japanese Navy received the first fragments of what had happened. Survivors from the destroyed battleship were recovered days later, shocked, hollow-eyed, and unable to explain how they had been torn apart in total darkness by a ship they never even saw. Their accounts were chaotic. Flashes. Explosions. Fire erupting from compartments they thought were safe. Some swore the Americans had developed some kind of night vision artillery. Others believed Washington must have been much closer than it actually was. But none of them could understand the truth. They had been outmatched by technology they didn't know existed. High-ranking Japanese officers read the reports with disbelief. For years, they had dominated night engagements using superior training, powerful torpedoes, and stealth tactics. Now, a single American battleship had reversed everything they believed. There were discussions, debates, even arguments among strategists. Some insisted the survivors were wrong, that the Americans had simply gotten lucky. Others, more cautious, feared the worst, that the Americans had found a way to see in the dark. But the truth would take months to fully settle in, and by then, radar-equipped American warships would be sweeping across the Pacific like a rising tide. Back on Washington, the crew received their first mail bags in weeks, bringing letters from home and news from far-off places that felt unreal compared to the war-torn waters around Guadalcanal. Sailors read their letters under deck lights, smiling at familiar handwriting, hunger for normal life flickering in their hearts. Some folded their letters carefully into pockets. Others tucked them inside shirts, close to their chests. Moments like these kept them human. They had seen death swallow ships whole. They had watched flames consume steel. But in those precious minutes with a letter from home, they remembered why they were here. Night after night, Washington steamed onward, radar screens glowing like quiet sentinels. The operators had grown more confident, fingers adjusting controls with subtle precision. No longer were they just technicians, they were the eyes of the entire task force. And the officers trusted them implicitly now. During each night watch, the bridge crew stood a little taller, knowing they possessed the kind of awareness a Navy could only dream of. During a routine nighttime sweep, a young seaman looked at the radar scope the same way someone once looked through binoculars, searching for a glimmer of movement. The screen was clear, just waves of electronic noise scrolling across the display. He smiled faintly. Even when the ocean was empty, the radar felt like a guardian, a presence that turned the unknown into something manageable. In older battles, night meant fear. Now, it meant opportunity. Discussions began forming among senior officers about how radar would reshape tactics entirely. Instead of avoiding night engagements, task forces could begin seeking them out. Radar would allow early detection of enemy formations, precise tracking, and coordinated fire even across miles of darkness. Destroyers could screen the fleet with radar sweeps instead of relying solely on lookouts. Battleships, with their massive fire control systems, could unleash coordinated broadsides at ranges that once seemed unrealistic. In war, advantages were temporary, but this advantage felt seismic. Washington's captain knew that their triumph wasn't merely tactical, it was psychological. The Japanese believed they owned the night. Now, that myth had been shattered. Rumors whispered that enemy formations were hesitating before making nighttime runs. That destroyer captains were doubting their own senses, afraid that American radar could spot them before they even finished launching torpedoes. Whether true or not, the uncertainty itself was a weapon. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon in a wash of deep red and orange, Washington's crew took in the view silently. The ocean looked peaceful, almost gentle, as swells rolled under the fading light. But the crew knew better. The Pacific could turn savage in minutes, and enemies could lurk beyond the curve of the earth. And yet, for the first time, the darkness felt like something they could face with open eyes. That night, Admiral Lee walked the deck alone, the wind tugging gently at his uniform. He paused near the rail, staring out into the blackness that stretched unbroken in every direction. Earlier in the war, many American ships had been ambushed in nights exactly like this, destroyers appearing out of nowhere, searchlights cutting through the dark, torpedoes tearing into hulls before lookouts could even shout warnings. Lee remembered those losses vividly. But now, radar had turned the tables. And he, a man who trusted numbers more than anything else, felt a quiet certainty: the enemy could no longer hide. Washington continued forward, her bow cutting cleanly through the water, her radar guiding her like a lighthouse built into her very soul. The crew didn't know where the next battle would be, or when, but they knew one thing for sure: whatever came next, they were no longer afraid of the night. They had claimed it. They had mastered it. And every Japanese commander who dared approach them under darkness would soon learn the same truth: the ocean at night belonged to the ship that could see. And no one saw better than USS Washington. In the seconds after USS Washington locked onto the Japanese battleship by radar, the ship transformed from a dark, silent shape gliding through the Pacific into a machine of pure mathematical precision. Deep inside the plotting rooms, operators hunched over glowing radar screens, their fingers flicking across dials and switches in rhythmic, almost rehearsed movements. The air wasn't loud, but it was thick, filled with the soft hum of electronics, quiet murmurs, and the constant scratching of pencils marking solutions before they vanished under the next set of figures. The Washington's fire control men weren't guessing, weren't hoping, weren't estimating by eye like the generations of sailors before them. They were feeding the Mark 8 radar and the Ford Mk-1A fire control computer with raw data: range, bearing, enemy speed, drift, wind direction, wave height, turret elevation specifications, letting the machine weave all those variables into a firing solution far more accurate than any human eye could ever dream of producing at night. For the first time in naval warfare, a battleship was preparing to fire not on what it saw, but on what it knew. Above deck, the turrets began to move with a slow, deliberate grace. From the outside, the motion seemed almost lazy, but inside each turret, the gun crews felt the enormous mechanical muscles shifting beneath them. No shouted commands, no frantic adjustments, everything flowed smoothly from the plotting rooms. Each turret officer watched his own instruments, listening to the quiet clicking of gears and the steady whir of motors as the barrels locked onto the angles calculated by the system deep below. The guns weren't being aimed by intuition or instinct, they were being aligned with mathematical authority, fed by the numbers racing through Washington's mechanical brain. The sailors didn't need to see the target. The radar had done the seeing for them. The battleship Washington held steady in the water, its bow slicing through the black Pacific like a silent predator. The Japanese battleship on the other end of that invisible beam had no clue that it was being dissected, measured, and solved. It kept steaming confidently through the night, unaware that every passing second brought it closer to the perfect angle of fire, closer to where Washington's barrels could deliver the kind of punishment battleships were built for but rarely unleashed with such certainty. The American ship's bridge remained dark, lit only by small covered lamps. Men moved with quiet urgency, communicating in short whispers, knowing the entire battle depended on maintaining surprise. Only the operators staring into their instruments understood just how precise the firing solution was becoming. Inside the plotting room, the chief fire control man leaned in toward the radar operator. "Range steady," he murmured. "Range locked. Drift compensated. Speed constant," came the reply. The chief tapped the firing table, nodding slowly as the final numbers clicked into place. Solution confirmed. That was the moment, quiet, almost anticlimactic, when the entire process reached perfection. Washington now held the naval equivalent of a sniper ready, zeroed-in shot at a target that didn't even know it was being hunted. On deck, the gunners felt a tension shift, like the air itself sensed what was coming. The barrels finished their final adjustments and stopped. The ship seemed to hold its breath. Far across the water, the Japanese battleship continued forward, engulfed in darkness, its crew relying on old doctrines and human eyesight, both useless on a night this black. Their ship had no radar, no mechanized fire control, no way to know that at that very moment, they were locked inside a mathematical kill box. Washington's radar men could even see small course corrections the enemy made, every slight turn, every speed adjustment, feeding those changes right back into the solution in real time. One of the younger sailors in the turret later said the silence just before firing was the most unreal moment of the entire war. He remembered hearing the faint tap of a wrench on metal somewhere in the turret, the gentle creak of a crewman shifting his weight, and the distant thrum of the ship's engines. No shouting, no alarms, no chaos, just calm mastery of the situation. Every man on Washington knew they were about to do something battleships were never supposed to do, hit a fully moving enemy ship at long range in pitch-black darkness, not by spotting splashes or searchlights, but by achieving a perfect firing math problem. The captain received confirmation from the plotting room that the firing solution was stable. He turned to his gunnery officer, the dim red glow from the map table reflecting off both men's faces. The words were simple, spoken in a level, almost controlled tone, "You may fire when ready." That was all it took. Down in each turret, those words flashed through the communication tubes, carried with them the energy of the moment, the inevitability of what was about to unfold. The gun captains placed their thumbs on the firing plungers. The range steadied. The target line held tight. The pitch and roll of the ship remained within the acceptable firing envelope. Everything was aligned. Everything was ready. Washington didn't need to see the enemy. Radar had already turned the darkness into numbers and the numbers into certainty. And in that frozen slice of time, between calculation and destruction, Washington stood as the peak of battleship engineering. A mechanical brain, a crew wired with training, and an ocean full of darkness that didn't matter anymore because the ship could see where no human eye could. When the guns finally fired, it wasn't guesswork. It was the cold, mathematical exhale of a perfect solution. When the order finally reached the turrets, it sliced through the internal silence like a blade. Every crewman in those steel chambers felt the words hit them, not with panic, but with a sharp jolt of electricity. The gunners steadied themselves, hands tightening on rails and levers. The turret officers gave their final nods. And then, in the space of a heartbeat, USS Washington unleashed its first salvo into the deepest dark of the Pacific. The blast wasn't just loud, it was overwhelming, a thunderclap in a world that had been utterly silent seconds before. Fire burst out from the muzzle of each 16-inch gun, a brief, violent flash that carved itself into the night and illuminated the deck brighter than any lightning strike. For an instant, Washington was no longer a shadow, she was a living explosion, a titan roaring into the void. The recoil shook the entire ship like it had struck something enormous and invisible. Men on deck felt their knees bend involuntarily as the vibrations thudded up through the steel plates. Below deck, dust shook loose from pipes and cables. Even deep in the engine rooms, sailors paused as the thunder rolled through the ship's bones. But then it was gone, the light vanished, replaced once again by darkness so complete it felt almost physical. And out across the water, the 9 giant shells were already flying, invisible arcs of destruction cutting through the air at nearly the speed of sound. No one aboard Washington could see them, but everyone felt their power. The only sign they had ever existed was the faint tremor in the ship's barrels and the thin ribbon of smoke drifting away on the night wind. The Japanese battleship, proud, armored, steaming confidently through the pitch-black ocean, had no warning. No flash was visible at the moment of firing. No sound traveled fast enough to tell them they were already doomed. The first hint of danger was the sudden shriek of shells tearing down from the sky, a sound like ripping metal multiplied 1,000 times. The lookout barely had time to open his mouth before the ocean around the ship erupted into towering pillars of water, each splash as high as the masts. Then came the first hit. A massive crack tore through the night as one of Washington's shells slammed directly into the Japanese battleship's forward section, punching through armor like it was sheet metal. For the crew aboard the Japanese ship, it was like the world itself exploded under their feet. The blast ripped open compartments, shattered equipment, and sent waves of flame rolling down the deck. Men were thrown off their feet, some crushed under collapsing steel. The bridge shook violently, officers grabbed onto anything bolted down as alarms erupted from every direction. They still didn't know where the attack was coming from. They couldn't see Washington. They couldn't find her searchlights. They couldn't spot gun flashes. They were fighting a ghost. In that split second of chaos, fear took root, not panic, but the heavy, suffocating realization that their legendary night fighting skills had just met a weapon they were never trained to face. Back on Washington, observers leaned over the rails, listening for the faint rumble of impacts across the water. Radar screens flickered, updating the target's position with cold precision. "Hit confirmed," one operator said quietly. The accuracy was surreal. The first salvo, fired in total darkness at long range, had struck home. The plotting crew immediately updated the firing solution, adjusting for the target's sudden deceleration after the blast. Operators called out the new numbers. Turrets began shifting again, hunting for the next perfect angle. The crew moved with machine-like fluidity, each man trusting the system, trusting his training, and trusting the invisible beam of radar that guided them. Across the water, the Japanese battleship reeled, trying desperately to assess the damage. Firefighters rushed into smoke-filled compartments. Officers shouted orders through the chaos, demanding reports, attempting damage control, trying to stabilize the ship. But confusion was spreading faster than orders. Their power flickered. Their communications crackled. Half the crew was still trying to figure out if they were under torpedo attack, aerial bombardment, or something else entirely. Their night optics and lookouts were scanning empty darkness. Somewhere out there, an enemy battleship was watching them without ever being seen. Then Washington's second salvo fired. Again, the night ripped open with fire and sound. Again, the ship shook with the deep, chest-hitting force of the guns. This time, the crew was braced for it, but the intensity still left them breathless. The shells roared into the sky, disappearing into the void. Seconds later, more explosions blossomed across the Japanese ship's hull. Another hit. Then another. The radar confirmed impacts before human eyes did. Fireballs began crawling across the enemy deck, lighting up twisted steel. One turret jammed. A secondary explosion from a ruptured ammunition locker tore through the midsection, spraying burning fragments across the water. Washington's gunnery teams worked like a single organism. Fire controlmen updated the solution. Radar tracked every movement. The turrets obeyed. The guns fired. And with every devastating blast, the Japanese crew grew more frantic. They finally spotted the muzzle flashes, distant, faint, near the horizon, but by then it was too late. Washington had already found her rhythm, already locked onto the perfect range, already walking her shells right across the enemy's hull with cold consistency. The first salvo had been the warning. The next ones were going to be the execution. When Washington fired that opening barrage, she didn't just announce her presence, she declared dominance over an ocean that once belonged to Japanese night fighting legends. The darkness they had mastered for years had just turned against them. Radar had flipped the ancient script of naval combat. In 7 minutes, the Washington would deliver 9 crushing hits. But it all began here, in this first burst of fire, this first shockwave that carved the night open and announced a new era of warfare. The moment Washington's second salvo landed, the battle shifted from shock to slaughter. Radar didn't just guide her guns, it tightened the noose around the Japanese battleship with each passing second. Inside the plotting rooms, the operators were locked in a rhythm now, voices low, movements precise, feeding updated range and bearing data into the mechanical brain as the enemy ship struggled to maintain course. Every few seconds, the target blipped across the radar screen, a pulsing echo in the darkness that might as well have been a heartbeat. But that heartbeat was slowing, weakening, breaking apart as Washington's shells hammered into it. The fire control computer's gears spun, recalculated, refined. The turrets obeyed instantly. And now, after those opening salvos, Washington was firing not with caution, but with terrifying confidence. The Japanese battleship, still reeling from the first explosive hits, had no time to recover. Flames were already licking up from the forward deck, spreading along splintered steel that had once been thick enough to shrug off anything short of a battleship-grade shell. But Washington wasn't firing randomly into the night. She was landing shot after shot like a surgeon carving into a target pinned down on an operating table. The third salvo roared out, the muzzle flashes illuminating the barrels like the gaping jaws of a monster. The ship shuddered from the blast, then settled as the shells arced silently across the water. Seconds later, the horizon erupted. Another explosion ripped through the Japanese hull, this time deeper, louder, angrier. A great plume of flame tore upward from the midsection, where machinery rooms had just been opened to the sea. On board the Japanese ship, every corridor had become a nightmare. Men staggered through smoke-choked hallways, grabbing bulkheads to stay upright as one explosion after another slammed through the metal under their boots. Officers shouted orders that were swallowed by fire and drowned by the roar of collapsing steel. The power flickered, died, came back, died again. Water poured through ruptured seams. Ammunition lockers were smoldering, ready to turn into ticking bombs. The ship was listing now, only a few degrees at first, but enough for the crew to feel it, enough to send a jolt of dread down every spine. Washington's fourth salvo hit almost immediately, her radar tracking every useless evasive maneuver the enemy attempted. The Japanese ship was turning slightly, trying to zigzag, but Washington's fire control team corrected faster than the enemy helm could move. Another cluster of shells hammered the battleship's stern, blowing out steering controls and sending a geyser of burning oil into the sky. The men stationed near the aft turrets screamed as they were swallowed by fire or hurled to the deck by the impact. One turret was knocked completely offline, its crew trapped in darkness, shouting for instructions that would never come. By now Washington's bridge knew what radar had already shown, the enemy was gasping. But there was no mercy in this kind of battle. If the Japanese battleship survived, she could still land a torpedo strike that would send thousands of American sailors to the bottom. So Washington continued the rhythm, lock on, fire, adjust, fire again. The fifth salvo lit up the ocean once more, and the hits this time struck amidships with devastating precision. A shell punched straight into an engineering compartment, igniting fuel lines and causing a blast so violent it blew a section of deck plating into the sea. The ship's internal lights died for good, plunging the crew into total darkness illuminated only by flames and the violent red glow of emergency lamps. The Japanese captain tried to fight back, ordering the remaining guns to search for the enemy. The few turrets still functioning fired blindly into the void, their shells falling uselessly into the ocean. They were firing at ghosts. Washington had no searchlights on. Her hull was nearly invisible against the Black Sea. And every time she fired, she moved slightly, preventing the enemy from pinpointing her muzzle flashes. Radar made her omniscient, darkness made her untouchable. Now came the 6th and 7th salvos, landing within seconds of each other. One tore open the battleship's bridge area, sending officers and equipment flying. Another detonated near the forward magazines, triggering a blast so powerful it split open the deck and sent smoke billowing hundreds of feet into the air. The crew tried desperately to flood the ammunition compartments, but shattered pipes and failing pumps made it impossible. In the chaos, men stumbled over bodies, searched for fire extinguishers, dragged hoses through flames, only to find the water pressure failing with every passing minute. By the time Washington fired her 8th salvo, the Japanese battleship was barely moving. The listing had grown worse, the port side dipping lower into the sea. The engines were sputtering. The once proud silhouette had become a twisted shape against the fire-lit smoke. Radar showed erratic readings now, not because Washington was missing, but because the ship was practically breaking apart under the pounding. The 8th hit struck the forward section again, blowing open compartments that had already been weakened, sending sheets of steel peeling away like the skin of a crushed can. Men were thrown into the water, swallowed by darkness and burning debris. Then came the 9th hit, the final, fatal blow. Washington's guns thundered once more, and the shells crossed the sky in their silent arcs. When they landed, they slammed directly into the Japanese battleship's hull near the waterline, rupturing internal bulkheads already strained by the violent listing. A massive secondary explosion rippled through the ship as compartments flooded simultaneously. The entire superstructure seemed to sag. Flames erupted through rents in the deck. And suddenly, almost gracefully, the bow dipped low, as if the ship were bowing to the inevitable. The Japanese crew fought with heartbreaking determination, but the battle was already written in the dark. In 7 minutes, Washington had scored 9 crushing hits, something no battleship had ever achieved at night, something no Japanese night fighting doctrine could have imagined. Radar had turned Washington into a machine of perfect destruction, and the Japanese battleship, once built to dominate the seas, was now a burning silhouette sliding deeper and deeper into the Pacific. Washington's guns fell silent. The smoke drifted. The echoes faded. And the enemy battleship, broken beyond saving, slowly began to die. The Japanese battleship, once a roaring engine of steel and firepower, was now a wounded giant bleeding into the Pacific. After the 9th hit tore through her hull, a strange quiet settled over the ship, an eerie, unnatural break in the chaos. The fires still raged, steel still groaned, and seawater poured into her ruptured compartments, but something fundamental had changed. The crew understood they were now fighting not for victory, but for time. The battle was no longer about defeating an unseen enemy, it was about holding the ship together long enough for as many men as possible to escape the fate tightening around them. Inside the forward compartments, water rushed in with terrifying force, cold and relentless. Crewmen sloshed through rising pools that reached their ankles, then their shins, then their knees. Some compartments were already flooded completely, the dim emergency bulbs flickering underwater like dying stars. Men hammered at jammed watertight doors, shouting for help, their voices muffled by smoke and choking steam. The list to port was growing, making every step a struggle. Loose equipment rolled across the tilted deck, crashing into bulkheads and knocking men off their feet. The once orderly warship had transformed into a twisting maze of fire, water, and collapsing metal. Up on the deck, the fire had spread like a living creature. Flames crawled over the superstructure, engulfing twisted railings and shattered gun mounts. Ammunition cooked off in sporadic bursts, popping like fireworks but carrying enough force to kill anyone within reach. Smoke billowed into the night sky, turning the stars into a blurred smear. A few surviving gunners tried desperately to turn their remaining turrets toward the invisible enemy, but the systems were dead. Hydraulic lines ruptured, gears jammed, and smoke blinded their view. They were like men trying to fight shadows with bare hands. The Japanese captain, bloodied and half-deaf from the explosions, clung to the railing near the remains of the bridge. His command station was gone, nothing but a torn, burning skeleton of metal, and yet he refused to abandon his position. He shouted for damage reports, for casualty numbers, for power status, but the answers, when they came at all, were fragments of despair, no response from aft turret. Engine rooms flooding fast. Pump lines broken. Port side bulkheads collapsing. These weren't status updates, they were the final chapters of a death sentence. Below decks, engineers tried desperately to restore power, but the generators were drowning. Seawater hissed as it hit the glowing hot gears, sending gusts of steam through the compartment. One by one, the lights died completely. Men lit small hand lamps, their beams cutting weak paths through smoke-filled rooms. Some tried to reroute damaged pipes, slamming valves shut with hammers. Others formed bucket chains, scooping water that poured in faster than they could remove it. They weren't fighting the enemy anymore, they were fighting physics, weight, pressure, gravity. And they were losing. On the deck, a group of sailors attempted to man the pumps manually, pulling levers with everything they had left. Their faces were smeared with soot and oil, their uniforms soaked with seawater. Every muscle burned as they heaved again and again, but the list kept increasing. One sailor lost his grip and slid across the tilting deck, rolling toward the edge before two others grabbed him by the arms and hauled him back. The deck was beginning to angle sharply now, and men had to cling to railings to stay upright. The fires burned so hot that rivets began popping from the hull, shooting out like bullets. The ship's skin groaned under the strain, bending and twisting. The superstructure leaned dangerously, tearing away from its supports. Every few seconds, another deep metallic bang echoed through the ship, a sound like a dying heartbeat. The crew had heard stories of ships dying like this, ships hit by torpedoes or bombs, but they never imagined a battleship could be unmade by gunfire alone. And yet here they were, living the impossible. The captain knew the truth long before anyone said it out loud: the ship was lost. But tradition, honor, training, everything he had ever lived by, kept him standing on that burning bridge as long as the deck remained under his feet. Around him, officers urged him to abandon ship, to save himself while they still could. He looked at them through smoke-filled air, his face illuminated by the fires below. "Save the men," he said quietly. "Get them into the water." His voice was steady, almost calm. It was the voice of a man who understood that this night would be his last. The abandoned ship order rippled through what remained of the crew, passed from voice to voice, shouted down smoke-filled corridors and across collapsing decks. Men scrambled to free rafts, to untie ropes, to help wounded comrades toward the rails. Some resisted, determined to keep fighting even as the ship died beneath them. Others froze, unable to leave the only home they had known for years. A few simply stared at the ocean below, dark and endless, knowing the water was their only hope and their greatest fear. The list grew sharper. Water rushed over the port side deck, swallowing equipment and bodies alike. Flames hissed as they met the seawater, sending up great clouds of steam. The bow dipped lower and lower, dragging the entire ship with it. The stern rose high, exposing the screws and rudders in a grim silhouette against the burning sky. One final explosion erupted deep inside the ship, a magazine or a boiler, no one would ever know for sure. The blast tore through the hull, sending a massive shudder through the entire structure. The ship groaned, twisted, and then began to slide beneath the surface. Men leapt into the water, some willingly, others swept by the motion. The captain remained at his post until the bridge dipped under the waves, his figure swallowed by the sea just as the fires were extinguished by the rising water. In moments, the great battleship disappeared beneath the surface, leaving behind only burning oil and the cries of survivors clinging to debris. The sea closed over the wreck like a lid sealing a tomb, and silence returned to the Pacific night. Washington's radar had killed a giant. And the ocean had taken the rest. USS Washington cut through the dark water with the confidence of a predator that knew exactly where it stood in the food chain. Even after delivering 9 crushing blows in 7 minutes, she didn't pause to celebrate or admire the flames licking the horizon. Her bridge crew remained laser-focused, eyes shifting between instruments, radar scopes, and the black water ahead. The Japanese battleship might have been dying behind them, but Washington's officers knew the ocean wasn't empty yet. The night hid more threats: destroyers, torpedoes, drifting wreckage, and even the unpredictable currents that could push them into danger. A single miscalculated turn could erase the victory they just carved into history. Captain Glenn Davis leaned over the chart table, the faint glow of the red lights washing over his face. The radar officer reported multiple smaller contacts moving erratically, Japanese destroyers scrambling, searching for the American battleship that had annihilated their flagship. Some were attempting attack runs, others were turning back, confused by the carnage Washington had unleashed. But confusion didn't make them harmless. Japanese destroyers were deadly in night combat, carrying torpedoes with ranges and explosives that could tear a ship apart instantly. And unlike battleships, they could maneuver quickly, weaving unpredictably across the water. Washington needed to move, not recklessly, but with exact, calculated precision. Her rudder shifted, slicing her bow smoothly through the waves as she executed a wide turn to starboard, distancing herself from the sinking battleship while keeping her own guns trained outward. The maneuver wasn't just evasive, it was strategic. By turning away, Washington denied the Japanese destroyers a steady bearing to fire their long lance torpedoes. These torpedoes, infamous for their range and power, were a nightmare in these waters. A single hit could flood multiple compartments, cripple engines, or even break a ship's spine. Captain Davis knew this better than anyone. So Washington didn't stay still. She moved like a heavyweight boxer pivoting after a knockout punch, ready, alert, unwilling to be caught off balance. Her engines rumbled as they increased speed. The battleship responded with a smooth surge, her hull cutting clean through the rolling swell. The crew felt the shift as the deck tilted slightly, the sensation of acceleration passing through their boots and up their legs. Men who had been bracing after the last salvo now moved with purpose, scanning the waters and checking equipment. Damage control teams swept the ship, verifying that the shock waves from Washington's own guns hadn't loosened fittings or ruptured lines. Even victory couldn't distract them from their duty. They knew that one flooded compartment could throw off the ship's stability, especially during high-speed maneuvers in the dark. The radar team called out updates every few seconds. One destroyer was moving in fast from the port side, likely attempting a torpedo launch. Another contact hung farther back, hesitating, probably shocked by the sight of their battleship erupting in flames. Captain Davis listened quietly, making decisions with quick, measured commands. Keep her at flank speed. Adjust bearing 5 degrees starboard. Maintain distance. Each instruction kept Washington just far enough from danger while positioning her to strike if needed. Her secondary batteries swiveled toward the unseen destroyers, ready to spit fire at a moment's notice. Lookouts strained their eyes across the black expanse, searching for the faint silhouette of a torpedo wake or the sparkle of gunfire. But the night was thick, almost oily, swallowing everything. Only the radar truly saw what was happening, and that was Washington's greatest advantage. While the Japanese destroyers zigzagged wildly, trying to locate the American battleship by sound or blind instinct, Washington traced their movements with perfect clarity. Their confusion became Washington's shield, their blindness her weapon. Then came the moment everyone aboard dreaded, the radar operator stiffened, eyes narrowing. "Possible torpedo in the water," he announced. The words were quiet, but they landed like a hammer blow. The room snapped into focus. Washington had been expecting it. Japanese destroyers didn't retreat without unleashing their deadliest weapons. Torpedoes were out there now, cutting silently through the water. The sensors couldn't track them directly, but the angles of the destroyer movements made it obvious: the enemy had fired. Captain Davis didn't panic. He didn't raise his voice. He simply ordered, "Hard to starboard. Increase to maximum revolutions." And Washington responded instantly, swinging gracefully into a turn that would have buckled a smaller ship. Her bow carved a wide arc across the ocean as the engines roared, pushing the battleship faster and faster. Men braced themselves against walls as the deck tilted under the lateral force. Somewhere out in the black distance, torpedoes knifed through the water, passing harmlessly behind them. A few seconds slower, a few degrees off, and history would have recorded Washington's name alongside the ships lost to invisible killers. But tonight, she was untouchable. The destroyers, realizing their torpedo strike had failed, began to retreat. Washington's radar tracked them slipping away, their movements frantic and disorganized. They wanted no part of a battleship whose guns spoke with such terrifying accuracy. The American ship held her course, maintaining high speed, sweeping the area, ensuring no surprise attack would catch her off guard. The fires from the sunken battleship lit the distant sky like a burning city, reflected in the waves that curled around Washington's hull. Finally, after several long, tense minutes, the immediate threats faded from the radar screens. The ocean grew quiet again. The Japanese fleet's confidence in night dominance had been shattered. Washington slowed, her engines easing into a steady hum. The crew exhaled, some for the first time since the first salvo. They had maneuvered through one of the deadliest night battles in naval history and emerged untouched. It wasn't luck. It wasn't chance. It was discipline, technology, and a captain who understood how to fight in a world where radar had replaced moonlight. Washington didn't linger. She continued her course, leaving behind the rising smoke and the debris of a battleship that once symbolized Japanese naval strength. Her crew knew they had witnessed something extraordinary, not just a victory, but the birth of a new kind of warfare. She disappeared into the darkness the same way she had entered it, silent, confident, and absolutely in control. The night had been long, silent in its darkness, yet alive with invisible motion beneath the inky waters of the Pacific. USS Washington glided through the black expanse, its hull cutting silently through the waves, while radar operators huddled over their screens, tracking every flicker of movement. The enemy was out there somewhere, confident in their centuries-old training, unaware that a new era of naval warfare had arrived. Moments ago, the first salvo had erupted from Washington's massive 16-inch guns, streaking across the night sky and striking the Japanese battleship with terrifying accuracy. Fire and smoke had erupted from its decks, secondary explosions cascading in chaotic rhythm as the enemy crew scrambled desperately to contain the damage. Now, in the stillness that followed, the Americans could see the aftermath only through their instruments, yet the impact was unmistakable. The once mighty vessel, a symbol of Japanese naval pride and skill, had succumbed to a combination of technology, calculation, and human precision. The crew moved with a quiet purpose, each man understanding the enormity of what they had witnessed. Officers conferred in hushed tones, reviewing reports and plotting the ship's movements. Radar screens continued to flicker, but there were no new contacts. The ocean itself seemed to hold its breath, reflecting the fading glow of distant fires and the occasional plume of smoke rising from the waves. In those moments, the lessons of the night crystallized for everyone aboard. They had relied not on flares, not on searchlights, not on centuries of experience alone, but on a new tool that allowed them to see what the human eye could not. Radar had given them the power to strike first, to calculate every angle, every distance, and every environmental factor with unerring precision. It was a weapon as much of intellect as of steel, a silent, invisible force that had rendered old night combat doctrines obsolete. Across the deck, gunners polished the barrels of their massive guns, the soot and smoke of battle coating their gloves and faces. The men were exhausted, yet their eyes gleamed with a combination of pride and awe. Each shell fired that night had been a carefully calculated expression of science and skill, a deadly ballet choreographed in silence. The psychological effect on the fleet would be profound, for both sides. Where once sailors had feared the unseen, relying on instinct and visual confirmation, now knowledge, the precise detection of enemy movements, would define supremacy. The Japanese, skilled masters of night warfare for generations, had been unprepared for a foe who could fight with the enemy's movements mapped out before a single shell fell. Washington's crew understood, perhaps better than anyone else at sea, that they had glimpsed the future. As dawn began to break, painting the horizon in shades of orange and gold, the reality of the night's engagement sank in. The Japanese battleship, once a towering leviathan of the fleet, had disappeared beneath the waves, leaving only remnants of smoke and oil slicks as evidence of its demise. Washington had maintained a careful distance throughout, maneuvering tactically to avoid torpedoes while maximizing the effectiveness of its fire. Every turn, every adjustment, had been calculated with a precision that left little room for chance. The ship had not only survived the night unscathed but had rewritten the rulebook on how night engagements could be fought. In the officers' wardroom, maps were spread across tables, charts marked with positions and distances, the data already forming the basis for new naval doctrines. The silence that hung over the crew was not one of defeat or despair, but of comprehension, a deep understanding that they had taken part in a historic moment. Throughout the day, the significance of the night continued to unfold. Naval intelligence officers studied the reports with a mix of fascination and urgency, recognizing that the old paradigms of visual spotting and intuition were no longer sufficient. The combination of technology and human skill had proven devastating, and future commanders would have to adapt or be left behind. Lessons from the engagement would ripple through the fleet, the importance of radar coverage, the necessity of rigorous training in new systems, and the ability to execute coordinated strikes before the enemy could even perceive a threat. Every man aboard Washington had been part of a demonstration that the very essence of naval combat was evolving. The era of relying solely on experience and sight had ended. Now, information, detection, and precise execution would decide victory or defeat. The crew themselves, though fatigued, felt a mixture of pride, awe, and sober reflection. They had witnessed a ship, once seemingly invincible, reduced to wreckage by weapons guided not just by firepower, but by intellect and calculation. Every sailor, from the youngest seaman to the commanding officers, recognized the historical weight of their actions. This was not merely a victory of one night, it was the proof that technology, when combined with training and strategy, could fundamentally alter the landscape of war. Conversations among the men touched on the future, on how fleets would fight from this point forward, and on the inevitable transformations that would sweep through naval engagements across the Pacific and beyond. The night had been decisive, but the lessons it imparted would last generations. As the sun fully rose, casting warm light over the darkened waters, Washington continued its patrol, but the atmosphere aboard was forever changed. There was a quiet confidence among the crew, a recognition that they had not only survived a historic engagement but had shaped the very course of naval warfare. The battle was over, but its impact was just beginning. For historians, tacticians, and sailors alike, that night would serve as a testament to the power of innovation, the value of calculated action, and the dawn of a new age where the unseen could no longer be feared, it could be understood, mastered, and defeated. In the end, the night that had begun with darkness and uncertainty concluded with clarity and purpose. The waters returned to calm, the wreckage sank, and Washington sailed on, carrying with it the knowledge that the future of naval combat had irrevocably changed. The lessons were as clear as the morning light: radar had redefined warfare, technology had surpassed tradition, and the courage and skill of those who wielded it had proven decisive. What had once been impossible, striking unseen, calculating perfect shots in total darkness, was now reality. And for every sailor aboard that ship, and for every commander who would study this engagement in years to come, the night would remain a symbol of innovation, precision, and the unstoppable momentum of progress. The battle over, the ocean returned to a deceptive calm, yet its surface bore silent testimony to the destruction wrought the night before. USS Washington's crew, though exhausted, felt the weight of what they had accomplished, knowing they had been part of a turning point in naval warfare. The Japanese battleship had sunk, a stark reminder that the old rules of night combat, relying on visual spotting, intuition, and tradition, were no longer enough. Radar had proven decisive, allowing the Americans to detect, track, and engage the enemy with unprecedented precision, changing the very nature of naval engagements. Officers reviewed their calculations, crew reflected on the events, and across the fleet, the lessons were clear: night battles could now be fought confidently without sight, relying on technology and meticulous strategy. The psychological impact was as profound as the tactical one. Fear of the unseen was replaced by mastery of information and instruments, forever altering how naval commanders would plan and fight. This night marked the dawn of a new era, demonstrating that innovation, calculation, and courage could redefine the battlefield, and the principles learned would shape naval doctrine for generations. Washington sailed on, its crew carrying more than a victory. They carried knowledge, experience, and the undeniable proof that the future of naval warfare had arrived.